The Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce runs a public lecture programme exploring contemporary issues. Teachers TV has access to these lectures, and today we bring you a series of short talks on the subject Restorative Justice in Schools. The speakers are Sir Charles Pollard, former Chief Constable of Thames Valley Police, Graham Robb, Board Member of the Youth Justice Board, Deputy Head Teacher Mel Stanley, and Head Teacher Kenny Frederick. We've invited some teachers along and we'll hear their responses to the talks in a short discussion afterwards.
Thank you. When I was the Chief Constable of the Thames Valley Police in the 90s, my colleagues and I were concerned that the criminal justice system didn't meet the needs of our communities. Indeed, why would anyone then consider that it did, when in real terms the criminal justice system excludes from its workings those very people who are critical to its success? Victims of crime, people like you and us all here together. Because everyone in this room has probably been a victim of crime on average in the last 4 years. Of course, the justice system does involve victims of crime as witnesses, but in their capacity as givers of evidence, in fact tools of the court, but it does nothing to recognise their intrinsic needs as people. No wonder, and it's still the same today, no wonder less than 1/3 of victims are satisfied with the criminal justice system. Now, I'm not here today to talk about criminal justice, as you know, but I'm just starting off with that because it's the lead-in to how this thing called restorative justice, or in schools, restorative approaches, what the principles are and how and why it works. Back in those Thames Valley days, we actually started experimenting with better ways of what we saw as doing justice with youngsters, because the police have jurisdiction over youngsters 17 and under the first 1 or 2 times they commit crime before they go to court. What used to be called cautions are now called something else. And we started bringing offending youngsters and their crime victims together in meetings with their respective families and supporters. And you know, it worked. It worked. It was quite incredible how it just worked. Everyone seemed to like it. Everyone seemed to find it valuable. Victims, of course, they had very high levels of satisfaction with it, for reasons I'll talk about later. But very important too, there was clear evidence that it was helping youngsters back onto the straight and narrow and to reduce their reoffending. And then one of my officers, who eventually was trained in these new methods, started using it in a troubled local secondary school called Drayton School in Banbury, which was in difficulty. In fact, it was in special measures. And at that time, they had a brand new head teacher, recruited to get them out of special measures, who was charismatic and innovative, and who then introduced restorative approaches into that school as one of the things he felt was important. And do you know what happened? It worked again. It actually worked again. This is something that really does work extraordinarily well. It had a big impact on behaviour in the school. It tackled bad behaviour, bullying and truancy, whilst at the same time reducing school exclusions. Now, the head teacher of that school was, of course, Graham Robb, and he and I have been working together ever since on restorative justice and restorative approaches. Of course, in schools we call it restorative approaches because that is different from the justice system, but the principles, as I said, are very similar. So let's just talk briefly then what this restorative justice, restorative approach is. What is it? Well, the first thing to do is debunk one of the myths. Whilst everyone hears that restorative justice comes from First Nation communities like the Maori, the Aboriginals and the Inuit, but actually it's also featured very strongly in Anglo-Saxon Britain until Henry II centralised justice so as to increase his control over the population. So whilst lawyers will tell you, and there's probably somebody in the audience, of the great traditions of our criminal justice system going back to as far as we can remember, apparently they're all completely wrong. The original system in this country was a form of community justice with restorative justice as some of the main principles. And that's actually the case with most communities. They develop over hundreds, thousands of years. But restorative justice today is very different from what they used to do. It's a long way from the 11th century. And let's be very clear about this straight off, because there are certain journals which paint a picture of restorative justice as being wishy-washy, eccentric, ineffectual, a sort of fashionable idea dreamed up by woolly-minded liberals. But on the contrary, this restorative justice and restorative approaches are based on very good proven principles. It is these days structured into processes that are robust, grounded in evidence, highly effective, and that can be replicated from school to school, from area to area. And there are two key principles which we want to get our minds on. To get a handle on this, if you can remember these two principles, you'll be with it. And the first principle comes from a famous criminologist called Niels Christie, who's actually a Norwegian criminologist, still alive, who in 1977 wrote a very famous paper called Conflicts as Property. Now, what he said was that most of us in the Western nations in our world have got it wrong regarding crime. Crimes are conflicts as well as being crimes, and in fact the damage that crime does to people and communities is far more relevant than the effect on, in quotes, the state, which our system is built on. And of course there are many things which are not crimes which cause harm to other people as well. All sorts of things, and so some civil disputes in legal terms also are very significant conflicts. And Christie said, if these conflicts are dealt with purely by professionals, people like us in this room probably, police, prosecutors, judges, probation, social workers, then in effect those professionals are taking away the conflict from the very people most likely to be able to solve it, the people whose conflict it is. Sounds sensible, doesn't it? It may sound a bit extreme, but actually it's bog standard common sense. What he said was that instead of the main system, or as well as the main justice system, the system should be to get people, all those whose conflict it is, to get them engaged with the problem and jointly to come up with a solution. In fact, Niels Christie said, we're all frightened in the West about conflict. We shouldn't be, because conflicts can be good, healthy things for a society. What they do, among other things, is provide potential for participation and activity by citizens, which in its place then leads to confident, active communities, something we all want. The crunch point that Niels Christie made was this. He said, the trouble with the present system is the professionals steal the conflicts. They take over the conflict, they try and tell people what to do, and so why would you expect it to work? Because the system, what's going to work is that the people whose conflict it is are the people who sort the conflict out. So that is the sort of principle number one, really, and for teachers and police officers, that's quite a big leap, because they're all control freaks. I've been a control freak. You've got to control class, you've got to be out there on the streets, you've got all these difficult situations, you've got to control them. Well, you can control them, but when you actually get to the conflict and get it to pull it away, there are ways in which this is exactly what you can do to solve it really very, very effectively. So, I mean, really, why would you ever think conflict can be solved by the professionals? It's actually a ludicrous idea. They can only be solved by those fully engaged who involve themselves. So, great idea, 1977, Niels Christie's written this paper, let's start doing it. Oh dear, this is not as easy as we thought. How do we do it? No one really knew. And then there was lots of people who were concerned about this, particularly traditional thinkers, because they thought that if you bring people together, victims who have been harmed by a crime are going to be very, very vengeful. They're going to want blood. Actually, we now know it's the very reverse. Bring them together and you get the very reverse of vengefulness. You get people actually wanting much less revenge, if they want revenge at all. Interesting point. But the next point of the story really then is the second person on the slide there, John Braithwaite, who's a professor in Australia at Australian National University, who developed a theory called the theory of reintegrative shaming. Actually, the word shame is a difficult word, or people find it difficult, and so he now uses the word remorse rather than shame. But for convenience, I'm going to use the word shame here. And as you can see, his book there really lays out how it works. And what Braithwaite said was this. He said that most of us, when we discuss crime, most of the public, ask the wrong questions. We always say, why is it that people commit crime? If we could just find out why people commit crime, we could sort it all out. He said, wrong question. The right question is, why do most people not commit crime? Because if you can find out why most people don't commit crime, can we then translate the lessons of that to those who do commit crime? And he said, one of the main reasons that people actually commit crime is the fear of being caught and the shame of being found out and the shame of what they've done in the presence of those they love and respect, like their parents and their families. If that is the case, we need to replicate a process which will do the same with people who have committed crime. So the logic, he said, was, where you have people who have committed crime, the way you would implement Christie's model of getting people together and giving them the conflict is this, that you want the offender, or offenders, faced with the impact, the harm they have caused on other people, face to face, they're right there, so they're hearing face to face what harm has been caused, in the presence of someone the offender loves or respects. Could be their parents, could be a teacher from school, could be anyone. And if you do that, certain things will happen. The first thing is that the offender will feel huge shame, but not stigmatized shame, like putting people in the stocks or some of the other methods we still use, actually, which cause so much shame that they're unlikely to cause a sensible reaction in the offender. But reintegrative shaming, whereby this is all kept in private and people hear what's happened, they hear the shame, and after you've gone through a certain process, you then move forward as to how you're going to put things right. And really, that's what then started to happen. People started trying this, and again, it worked. When we started doing this in Thames Valley, we went to the meeting, I was already quite worried. We'd had people trained, and we've got these people there. It worked. It's just amazing. Now, it doesn't always work. It's not a panacea. There are no panaceas around with crime or in school behaviour. But believe you me, it works a lot of the time, in a lot of cases, in situations where nothing else does seem to work. Moving on then, this is really a complete paradigm shift in our thinking. In the criminal justice system, we're used to pigeonholing people in categories. We have a box over here with victims, a box over here with offenders, and a box over here with the community, and we deal with them all separately. Why would you expect it to work if you deal with them all separately? Bring them together, and you find the problem in this one is solved by something here, and it links in with something over here. So it's not actually rocket science, the theory of this. So what has been invented, as I'm now coming to the close of this, in the criminal justice system, essentially bringing people together can be done in lots of different ways. It can be a very small group. Well, let's take the middle way. In crime, it could be a youngster or an adult, for that matter, has committed a moderately serious offence, and around that is going to be created a conference. It could be in conjunction with the courts or instead of court. And that takes quite a lot of preparation, quite a lot of care, and a little bit of time to get it all right, but you'll get very good results. Another way is just for a police officer out on the streets who's trained in this, will just come across the streets. He'll come across kids hanging around about the shops. When we sort of start talking about ASBOs and all these big things, you don't need ASBOs for that. You know, some of these things, just sort the problem out by your training and bring them together in the way I've described. Doesn't always work, but it works an awful lot of the time. And then sometimes you have very big conferences, 30, 40, 50 people, over very major community problems. So that in Thames Valley, typical one, a street at war, police have been called there 79 times in the last year, new police officer on the block, trained in restorative justice, calls a conference, gets about 20 people together of that street. Very, very powerful, very emotional, and the police have never been called back since. And the two main protagonists in that street go off on holiday together. Now, I'm going to move this. And it's true, yeah. I mean, this does happen, believe you me. These aren't extreme stories. There are lots of stories, lots of cases just like that. Okay, finally then, what we've got here then is a new form of dialogue. It involves safe processes to bring people together. It's not about legal or technical consequences, but about the real issue, harm caused by one person to another, the social and emotional harm. And that impacts on the very fabric of society. A key to this is the person who facilitates these conferences has to be trained, 3, 4, 5 days training, probably 3 days we can do it now. And they have to be very neutral, and their whole thing is to give the conflict to the people there. Okay? A really good facilitator, you don't even know they're there. But it's a very clever system, which I'm not going to go into detail, of how you go through a process with the people in this group, in this meeting. And it's a very, very powerful process, believe you me, in which the offender or the perpetrator is held to account. You end up with an agreement, what's called an outcome agreement, of the offender agreeing to do certain things, and then you need to monitor that agreement. What is this and what is it not? What it is not, what I've just described is not the same as mediation. It's called restorative conferencing. There are some similarities with mediation, but it's some very fundamental differences too. First, the fact that this is very much about holding a perpetrator to account, which is quite a different phenomenon. It's a very powerful, it's also the most powerful one. So that's what it is not. And what it is now a well-proven system with a vast body of evidence now done available to measure it. This has been more researched than almost anything else in criminal justice, and in schools quite a lot, but there's still a long way to go, which is why we're very grateful to Paul Hamlin and Esme Fairbairn, who are funding a very big project in Bristol to test it out exactly like that. But in crime, just a few headline figures, we're talking about victims of crime, about 90% satisfaction levels. That is huge, about 3 times as much as you get with the normal system. 85% of victims were recommended to others. And in terms of reoffending, which is very important, we now have got the evidence that this can reduce reoffending very significantly, sometimes in some schemes as much as halving reoffending. This is big stuff. Usually we talk about 10% as being good. Okay, so this is a very, very powerful tool. In the school system, and I'll leave others to talk about that, we're talking there about improving behaviour, improving attainment, dealing with bullying, and reducing exclusions. I think with that, I'm going to hand over to the teachers. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Graham Robb, and a colleague of the force of nature that is Charles Pollard over a number of years. It was an honour to be part of the Drayton School team that was learning about restorative practices, making mistakes, learning from them again, and moving on. And what I want to do this evening in my short spot is just to give you a feel about why we were doing this and what it taught us. I'm then going to ask my colleague Mel from Deptford Green School to talk about current practice based on all the good work that went on in Lewisham and in other parts of London and in other parts of the country, and goes on now to learn how we apply restorative approaches in all settings in a school, from the classroom through to the community-facing aspect of school work. Then I want to finish off with a quick snapshot of where is restorative work now in schools in the UK, and some thoughts about next steps. When I first arrived at Drayton, we were using restorative justice practice, as Charles was describing, for some very, very high-level incidents. Issues of racism, issues of arson, issues of theft, of bullying, of serious behaviours. And we were finding that it worked. We were finding that it worked in various measures. A, that we were able to keep the youngsters in learning. B, that we were able to bring satisfaction to the victims of some of those activities in ways that other approaches weren't bringing them. But it then became very apparent, very quickly, that this was far more than just a technique for dealing with the highest level incidents in a school. It was far more about the relationships that characterised the way in which adults and young people should work with each other in a whole school context. And therefore, it's about all your school policies. And I'm sure that's something that Mel and other colleagues will comment on later on. So the Drayton story told me, first of all, here is a very powerful tool the outcomes of which produce extraordinary high levels of satisfaction in dealing with very tough incidents. But it then said to me, it was the way in which we approached whole school development. And for a school in special measures, that was the highest priority, as you can imagine. So 3 key lessons for me from the Drayton story. First of all, our restorative approaches promoted learning and behaviour changes by young people and by adults. We were changing the way we as staff worked with young people, the way we worked with each other as adults, the way we worked with parents and other partners. And I'm sure that's something we'll come back to in the questioning. A whole school approach is not only about conferences, that is an absolutely critical tool, but it's a range of other ways in which you work with youngsters to develop the sort of learning that Charles has described in the conferences. And just to give you one little example of it, this is a card from Bournemouth, which gives the teachers in one school the sort of questions that you take youngsters through in a restorative conference. But in this school in Bournemouth, they've started from, this is the card that all staff have to work with all conflicts, be it in the classroom, in the playground, wherever. And I think there are lots of bits of learning that we've done over the last 3 or 4 years about how to apply that wider understanding of harm and how it can be repaired. So that's the second bit, whole school as well as conferencing. And the third element is that this does build community engagement. As you'll hear a little later, there are numbers of ways in which schools get involved in restorative work. By working with police colleagues, as we were, by work with youth offending teams, as often happens now, by work with other partners in local authorities, as is happening in different parts of the country. All of that builds community engagement. I think there are 3 key principles that I hold to about restorative approaches in school. And then I'm going to invite Mel to come and share her perspectives from one school on those. First of all, to state the obvious, that unless you have positive relationships in a school, you will not get effective learning. Effective relationships are at the heart of attainment and achievement. If there is a stress or a conflict between you and a child in the class, or between you and the class, you are not going to be able to manage as effective teaching and learning as you wish to achieve. Positive relationships are at the heart of effective learning. And the second principle, those who've caused harm need to learn by facing up to those that they have harmed. They need to understand the harm that they've caused. The language that you use for that in a school is different than in a criminal justice setting, but it's the same principle. Somebody who's caused harm needs to understand the harm that's been caused. And finally, those who have been harmed need to have the chance to be heard and know that they've been heard and know that they can have a say in how the harm can be repaired. It's the repair of the harm that produces the long-term change. There is a lot in restorative processes behind those 3 principles. I see it in the right setting, when schools are ready for it, as an incredibly powerful and positive tool and ethos for children, families, staff and the communities. And I'm now delighted to welcome Mel as Deputy Head of Deptford Green School, who has taken up the baton in a most dynamic way and worked with her colleagues from Lewisham, developing restorative practices in Deptford Green School. Mel.
I want to start off by telling you just a little bit about where I started in all of this, because 4 or 5 years ago, I'd become very jaded and very fed up with my job. I was excluding children and feeling increasingly uncomfortable about it and not happy. And I was just so lucky to be part of a local education authority who had Sian Williams, who'd had a vision of how you could use restorative justice in schools in order to make the sorts of differences that you've already heard about tonight. And a friend of mine went on one of the trainings that Sian had organised, and she said to me, you really ought to go and find out about this restorative justice. And I had heard of it, but I'd not heard of it in terms of school and education. So I thought, well, what have I got to lose? So I went. I spent the first day thinking, oh yeah, you're not going to tell me I'm not excluding. I spent the second day thinking, oh no, hang on a minute, there might be something in this. By the third day, I was thinking, how am I going to go back to Deptford Green and convince everybody that we've got to start working in this way? And then the reality hit. And the reality hit on the wet morning at break, when, I've got to change the names and I must remember to get this right, when Aaron was brought to my office in floods of tears in a terrible state, with a huge sort of boot mark in the middle of his back. And my immediate response was to leap up and, oh, Aaron, what on earth has happened? And he told me about what that Toby'd fly kicked him in the back. And I thought, oh, and usual sorts of responses. And Toby was duly brought to me by one of the playground supervisors. And then I remembered, no, hang on a minute. You know how to do this now, stay calm. Listen to them. So Toby, tell me what you've done. Well, I've fly kicked Aaron in the back. Right, okay, excellent. So he's telling me the truth. So Toby, what were you thinking at the time? Well, he said, the thing is, miss, I just found out that in my next lesson I didn't have to go to anger management anymore. My anger management teacher told me that I'd finally passed the course. And do you know what? I was so happy and I was so excited that I just ran into the playground, and unfortunately Aaron was in the way. Which completely floored me. Right, so, okay, right, so how have you affected Aaron? Well, it's obvious, isn't it, miss? He's crying, I've hurt him. I thought, well, yeah, it is obvious, actually, what a silly question. Right, okay, let's talk to Aaron now about what's happened to him. Aaron, how has Toby affected you? And he looked at us and he said, I'm not crying because he's kicked me. Yeah, it's hurt, but that's not why I'm crying. He said, miss, you know, you've been nagging me for weeks about my school shirt and about the fact I haven't got the proper shirt on. And we don't have much money. He said, and finally, my mum was able to give me the money to buy the new proper shirt. And now look at it. Look what he's done to my shirt. And there's more. Because when I go home tonight, I can tell my mum this. She won't believe me. And he's still crying. She's going to think that I've just been silly in the playgrounds again. And now Toby starts crying. And then she'll send me to my room, and then I won't get any supper, and then I'll just get in even more trouble, and none of this is my fault. So now I've got two boys in front of me crying, and I'm thinking, oh, where's my notes? I don't know what to do. Right, okay, so I'm thinking, right, it's obvious, isn't it? It's just so obvious what needs to happen here. I've got to ring home, I've got to tell Toby's mum what he's done, I've got to ring Alan's mum, right. No, I'm not allowed to do that. Right, okay. What do you think should happen now? Silence. I'm thinking, oh, come on, boys. You know, it's obvious what's got to happen now. I need to ring home. You know, it's really obvious. Silence. And I'm remembering the words from my training, don't give them a solution. It needs to be them. Let them own the problem. And suddenly, Toby went, I know. I can take his shirt home and wash it. And I'm like, whoa. And Aaron, like, perks up a bit. He quite liked this idea. So the shirts came off and there was a bit of lending going on. I'm thinking, oh, God, I'm sure I should be ringing the mums. And, you know, early the next morning, Toby was outside my office with the shirt and the collar was still a bit damp. So we had to put it on the radiator so it would be dry for Aaron when he got in. And the shirt was handed over and the full apologies were given and the absolute assurance it would never happen again. They made a formal agreement and off they went. And as they left my room, I was just like, wow, I couldn't believe it. Because they'd come up with a solution that was far better than anything I'd have ever thought of. They'd done it themselves. They didn't need the answer from me. They were both happy. And I don't know, a lot of learning had taken place there for them and me. And for them, they were both then back in lessons. There was no exclusion, and there would have been. In the old days, as I like to call them, there would have been an exclusion. And I learned something very important for me in that moment of asking about what was going on for them, because I thought I knew, and I think teachers often do. And that's what a lot of students complain, that we don't really listen to them, because we do think we know, and I thought I knew and I didn't. So in that moment I learned, and I've got so many, and they learned, and you know, that's what school's all about, learning. And I've got so many stories about how we use classroom conferences, about how teachers and students now come together and really do genuinely listen to each other. About our peer mediators who are normally up here with me, telling you about how they work with each other. And I've just got so much that I could tell you about the ethos of our school, where there's so much less shouting. Children hand things in our school. They hand in £10 notes and iPods, and they really do. And they say they do it because they think about the feelings of the person who's lost it. Okay? I haven't got any more time, so I'm just going to end up by saying that the really great thing about Deptford Green is that if you come to learn and work in our school, if you make a mistake, you get the chance to learn from that. You're not just made to pay for it. Thank you.
Mel, thank you very much indeed. So a snapshot of what's going on at the moment around the UK then. Some of the earliest restorative justice in schools work was supported under the Youth Justice Board pilot in the early years of this century. And if you're wanting to look at data from some of those pilot schools, I'll just give you a couple of headlines. This was working in 26 schools, looking at some 630 conferences. And what we were seeing there was that, judged by external and internal validators, we got 92% of the conferences reaching a successful conclusion. In other words, going through the process, coming to the end of a period of review and saying that the conference had been successful. Of those, 96% of the agreements that were reached, that Charles was talking about, 96% of those agreements were still holding after 3 months, which compared to other behaviour measures is really quite a startling figure. And critically, what did the people who were involved in it think? 93% of participants in those 627 conferences said that they felt the process had been fair. And that's the young people who caused harm and the ones who had experienced harm and the other participants. So some schools got involved through Youth Justice Board pilots. Others have got involved through the prevention funding through the youth offending teams. Others have got involved in partnership work through work with the local police services. Some local authorities took positions on restorative justice work very early on. And Mel's talked about the work of Lewisham in producing this book, Restoring the Balance, which was a seminal book for many schools around the country in thinking about how you implement restorative justice as a school. What are the readiness factors? How do you train? How do you deploy people who know how to use restorative approaches? How do you evaluate it? So a range of ways in which schools have become involved in that. Why have they become involved in it? My view is, A, because they hear from practitioners like Mel, like Ian, like other colleagues, some of whom are here this evening. They hear those sort of stories and they compare them with their other practice. And they say, this gives us a learning outcome for young people. And that's what we are around as schools. It fits into a view of what learning should be about. It fits into an understanding of how young people develop and change, and how you can help them to build the language, to solve problems, to deal with conflict, to understand how to relate to others. I think that's why schools are adopting it, because they see it fitting into an ethos of learning. The successes we're still learning about nationally. There is some hard evidence of its impact on exclusions. 3 high schools in Sefton in 2004-2005 on one measure of the number of days of fixed-term exclusions saw a 57% drop in the number of days of fixed-term exclusions across 3 high schools. There's anecdotal evidence and some statistical evidence around exclusion data. And as Charles was mentioning, the work that's going on supported by Paul Hamlin Foundation and the Esme Fairbairn Foundation is supporting a project in Bristol which is trying to capture wider evidence of the impact of restorative work. What is the impact on the attainment and achievement of the youngsters involved in this? What's the trajectory of the youngster who might otherwise have been excluded, as Mel was saying? What's their trajectory staying in school? What's the evidence around the range of behaviour measures? But critically, what's the range of evidence around the view of young people and staff of relationships in the school? Many schools for years have been capturing through surveys, work with school councils, the perceptions of youngsters of feeling safe in their schools. And the Bristol project is going to try and capture some of that data as restorative approaches are introduced into those schools. So there is work to do to capture evidence. But in the meantime, to finish off this part of the evening, some reflections from me about where we go next on restorative approaches in schools, learning from what's happened not only in England, but in Scotland, where some local authorities, supported by the Scottish Government, have taken forward some restorative approaches in schools work as well, and in Wales and in Northern Ireland. So where are we now? I think we've come a long way in understanding what it takes to lead a school that wants to implement restorative approaches. We're way beyond where Charles and I were in 1998 and 99. But there's still more to do, which is about understanding of governance, understanding of curriculum, understanding of the partnership work in relation to your partner agencies and your local communities in relation to restorative work. And I think there are some really exciting opportunities at the moment for schools, and I will focus on England now. Forgive me for that focus immediately. First of all, anti-bullying guidance that's come out recently from the Department of Children, Schools and Families under the heading Safe to Learn gives a framework that I think schools that are ready to take on restorative practice will leap at. It talks about understanding and approaching young people and their bullying relationships in a way that I think restorative approaches really fits nicely with. The Ofsted framework focusing on emotional development of learners. That's how schools are being evaluated now by Ofsted. And their self-evaluation framework that schools are using gives all sorts of levers for schools that are ready to use restorative approaches. But most excitingly are all the curriculum opportunities, particularly the secondary curriculum recently announced. The PSHE Personal Wellbeing strand that was announced in July, a really important development for the way in which you develop the skills and abilities of youngsters to understand emotion, understand relationship, cope with conflict. And that clearly is building on all the excellent work that was going on through the social and emotional aspects of learning work within the primary curriculum in the last few years. And then the 14 to 19 diplomas and what's being called the personal development curriculum. I think there are emerging lessons now from the pilot schools implementing diplomas that we have got to learn from to understand how restorative practice is linked with the 14 to 19 curriculum. So, a number of curriculum opportunities, a number of opportunities in the way that we now talk about schools engaging with partners, a number of opportunities for the extended schools agenda. Sometimes colleagues say to me, well, should this not be a national strategy from the Department for Children, Schools and Families? My answer to that at the moment is no. And there are various reasons for it. I think head teachers and governors and school leadership teams need to be really clear about what it is that they are getting engaged in. And this is something that you have to want to engage with at the right point in the development trajectory of your school. I think there are real issues of support that the DCSF can provide, but I don't think we're at the stage where there should be a national strategy. I think it is far better that schools, local authorities, partnerships of schools learn about restorative work by hearing from colleagues engaged in the work and decide for themselves, we want to take this on because we are ready for it. I think, to summarise, I think many people involved in restorative approaches in school have a vision which says that restorative approaches is about learning for children and young people in a way that other approaches are not. It is coherent as an approach to understanding and leading school development for children's learning to be citizens in the communities of the future. Thank you very much.
Right, good evening everyone. I'm Kenny Frederick. I'm head teacher of George Green's School in the Isle of Dogs, and I think my job now is to rubbish everything that they've said there really and say it's all nonsense. And of course I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to go through just sort of some of the things that happen in a school and the approach that we take in our particular school. So mine is a very large comprehensive school, 11 to 19 school. We're an inclusive school. So our job is if you live in our community, you should be able to go to our school, whatever you need. Our job is to meet that need. We're a humanities specialist school and specialising in citizenship particularly. And one of our aims is to ensure that our students are citizens rather than tourists. They're not just passing through. We're a training school, so I think it's really important to train staff, pupils, and outside agencies and everyone we work with. And we're an extended school in the full sense of the word, so we've got a whole range of professionals and voluntary services and people working with us, and that's very important. We're also being commissioned recently to deliver youth services in the Isle of Dogs, which I have to tell you is an interesting development. And actually, in terms of conflict resolution, that's really important. And one of the things we try to do, community cohesion, I think is really important for us. We're the only secondary school in the Isle of Dogs. We work very closely with our primary partners and other colleagues. We work closely basically with anybody who can help us. Because what goes on in the community goes on in our school. You can't separate the two. We can't say it's 4 o'clock, off you go home, nothing to do with us. And one of the things we always say is we're trying to avoid blame. We all take responsibility. We can't solve the world's ills by ourselves, neither can the police, the voluntary agencies, the kids, and so on. So it's about accepting that responsibility. And as head teacher, that often gets me in lots of trouble and there's lots of conflict that I have to deal with. But it's very important. And I think one of the things about it is that we have to be prepared to change. When you're working in that sort of context, we all have to change and recognise that sometimes we're doing things wrong. And that's quite interesting when you're sometimes working with teachers and adults who sometimes want revenge. Now, the sort of thing, the issues, so let's look at the fact that restorative justice, conflict resolution, we live and breathe it. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but you give it a go. The sort of issues that you have, and particularly for us, the Isle of Dogs, I don't know if you know it, but it is like an island, even though it isn't physically, but it feels like an island sometimes. And one of the issues that we have is that we have a community that doesn't trust authority, that sorts things out for themselves. So that can cause a few problems. Something goes wrong, they can be down there, banging the door in, trying to sort it out for themselves, and that can be the parents. So that's a bit of an issue. And we've had to work on that over the issues. We have the Isle of Dogs endemic racism. where there's racism, there's sexism, there's homophobia. There are ingrained attitudes that come from the community into the school. And we have to work at changing that all the time. And these are sort of issues that we have to deal with. And, you know, I'm someone who've taught in London all my life, and it is very different in that particular part of the world. It's in your face, it's there, and you have to challenge it and you have to deal with it. There's another issue about, because conflict resolution and restorative justice or approaches work if people will admit that they've actually done the crime. And, you know, sometimes I'm sitting there, you know, something has happened, we have the video evidence, we have 15 witnesses, we have DNA, you name it, CCTV, and the child didn't do it. And the mum will say to me, well, Mrs. Frederick, he swore in his nan's life that he didn't do it. And I believe him because he wouldn't do that. So, you know, and it's very difficult sometimes to move forward. So you need a sense of humour, first of all, to actually be able to go back and, you know, try to work through that. But it is a real problem because you only get someone to change if they can actually admit that there was a problem. So that sometimes happens. And the other thing we have, again, is, you know, our youngsters and in the community, the way of solving the problem is either to scream and shout and make lots of noise and have a temper tantrum, or to hit out. So we have to model a different sort of behaviour. So it's very much about the culture of the school, the way that we treat each other, the way the children see us treating each other, you know, and being prepared when you're doing the restorative approach and doing the conflict resolution. Sometimes that's between adults and children, because sometimes we as teachers and adults say the wrong thing, shout at the appropriate, or whatever it is we do. We have to be able to prepare to say sorry. And it's quite interesting sometimes when we've got these sort of conferences going on, sometimes between a child and a teacher, and it's actually one of my support member of staff, who's the person who's trained, has been most trained in the subject, who does that. And it's great, the kid will say, you know, I was bang out of order, sir. And the teacher will say, you know, I was really sorry, I was a bit down, or whatever. And it's sorted. So it's trying to actually get that approach, but it's not just about the children, it has to be about the adults as well. Now, our ethos is all about we're all different, all equal, valuing each other, respecting each other, and so on. And it is really important that youngsters know how the other person has felt, what that felt like. And very often they'll think of a way of how to repay them and so on. And that works, as I say, some of the time. No, you know, one size doesn't always fit all. You have to do a number of things. One of the issues for us is time, and the restorative approach is sometimes that's described, you know, is very lengthy. We don't, to be honest, have the time. We've just got too much conflict, I'm sorry. So we have to find something that works. We sometimes work with groups of youngsters because we've had to deal with gangs. We've had to deal with all sorts of things, so we'll work in groups. We've trained lots of members of staff, we've trained pupils, we've trained lots of people to actually listen, talk, try and find solutions. We're very much involving the young people on that. Now, I mean, we're a Safer School partnership. We work very closely with the police, and we have had a Safer School officer for 6 years, which has been amazing because now people report crime, not only the youngsters but the parents. We're actually able to do that. That's a big move forward on the Isle of Dogs, and that movement has been fantastic in working for us. And our police officer has been part of that training and is very much involved in that restorative approaches. We do all sorts of things when we have real issues. We take lots of risks. One of the things, we took a whole group, and we take them every year now to Belfast, where we've had racial conflict, and we took the first year we took a whole group to Belfast to see what a divided community looks like and feels like, and actually put them together, the very worst racist, you know, gang leaders, you name it. I was very scared that week, I can tell you. But, you know, that worked, and actually taking those risks, doing that, and they were so shocked when they came back. We said to them, look, is that the sort of community you want to live in? And they were quite clearly they didn't. And they were really shocked by the intransigence of some of those youngsters they met who'd lived in that sort of community for so long who didn't want to change. So sometimes you have to, you know, make them be faced with whatever the issues are. So as far as we're concerned, I think it's about a culture, an emotional literacy, a very feeling school. You know, we rely on gut feeling. The kids will tell us if something's going to kick off, if something's happening in the community. But we have to work with parents. It's not just enough to work with the child. You have to work with the parent. You have to work with the voluntary services, the youth service. So as far as we're concerned, this is about a community, not just about a school. We, for instance, have started using acceptable behaviour contracts, which some people think is a real, you know, big stick and a hammer. Actually, it's not, because it means it brings brings the parents, brings the kids and other agencies to looking actually what the issues are, how can we help them to work together, because lots of our parents have lost control, can't set the boundaries for the youngsters and so on. So we have to try to work with those. So we use a variety of approaches, but it is very much, as far as I'm concerned, about a school culture. It's about intervening before things happen. It's about involving the youngsters in their own, what has happened. And most of them actually fully accept when they've done wrong. The thing is, well, I was angry. And I say, well, that's not enough. They've got to see that there are consequences for what they do. So everything that's said today, I would agree with. Except that it doesn't always work, and in the way that nothing else always works. You have to have a variety of approaches, try different things. If it doesn't work the first time, you do it again, and you do it again, until eventually it does work. Thank you.
With these thoughts in mind, let's hear some responses from our teachers in the audience.
So I thought it was fascinating, and I think as a whole school approach, it fascinates me. It just makes me wonder, because I don't think they explained it here, how it's introduced to the children. Because I could see how it could be introduced to teachers, to partner agencies, but how is it introduced to the children in the school? Do they first come across it during a conflict resolution? I know you're involved in that kind of thing, so you might be able to tell me that.
In working for the borough, you get to know what different schools are doing, and they do completely different things. So some will start off by having large conferences, and that's how students get involved with it, and parents. But where they go for the whole school approach, and generally our schools have started off with big conferences, and then they've trickled things down and connected it with social emotional aspects of learning, and the PSHE curriculum, citizenship, and all that sort of thing. And they also work with individual classes. When things go rocky in particular classes, the whole class will have a conference. So there's lots of different ways.
The issue of exclusion is, of course, incredibly important. But I was a bit disappointed that we swung to the extreme level. It's extreme when you have to exclude a child. And we know, yes, the numbers are higher, much higher than they should be. I think the exciting bit is when it's in mainstream schools, sorting out a lot of, when I say minor issues, it's the minor issues that really drive us teachers mad. Also, because that's what makes you work so hard.
Yeah. But they're not minor to the kids, those issues.
Not. And the reoffending, that's what really has to stop. I mean, you'll have the children that keep doing the same things every day. Well, that really probably is what drives teachers mad, is the daily the same children that they're seeing.
I'd like to have seen more ways of getting at training. It looks like if you've got a head or the senior management are really into restorative approaches, you're there and you've got a good chance as a member of staff of getting trained. We need to be able to access this information and have good solid research quickly if it's as good as they say it is.
I do agree with Graham Robb though that it shouldn't become for schools a national strategy systemised. My feeling is if it turns into a national strategy, it will be something that you have to comply with, and I don't think it will work like that.
Yes, I tend to second that. I think if it's placed upon, there's too many initiatives, and I think people are tired of initiatives. But if they take it with their own hands, with a passion, it will drive it, and it will work, and it will be successful.
I think it fits very nicely into the Every Child Matters agenda as well, working with partner agencies. And once again, also it fits in, as far as curriculum is concerned, with the personalised agenda as well. So although perhaps not a national strategy, and agreeing with what you said, I think things dovetail very, very nicely.
And we need to be sharing the findings and the evaluation of that training, but it's quite optimistic.